In 2017, the conservative media outlet PragerU posted a 5-minute video that has since been viewed over 22 million times. In it, political scientist Carol Swain addressed the party realignment of the 20th century, a process in which Republicans, originally based in the Northeast and committed to liberalism, and Democrats, once solidly Southern and dedicated to conservatism, gradually swapped political ideologies, demographies, and geographies. Despite a half-century of scholarly work on the topic by her fellow political scientists and historians, Swain asserted that this story of the two parties switching identities is a myth. In particular, she called into question the Southern strategy, in which Republicans used race-based appeals to win over conservative whites in the 1950s and 1960s. Asserting there was no evidence of any such effort, Swain insisted it had been simply fabricated by left-leaning academic elites and journalists. Despite such claims, the record is clear. There was, indeed, a long-term transformation in the two parties, first at the national level and then, subsequently, at the state and local levels, a process that stands at the core of 20th century political history. Over several decades, Democrats abandoned their role as the party of slavery, segregation, and white supremacy to champion civil rights. In response, Republicans retreated from their original racial liberalism and courted white resentment. The Southern strategy, well documented in manuscript archives, public speeches, party platforms, contemporary reporting, polling data, oral interviews, memoirs, and elsewhere, has long been accepted as a wholly uncontroversial fact. Indeed, Swain herself had acknowledged this reality in an earlier work. Only recently have conservative partisans challenged this well-established history, presumably seeking to blunt accusations that Republicans have embraced racism today by pretending that Republicans never embraced racism before. Clinging to the claim that the grand old party is still the party of Lincoln, today's conservatives have, ironically, tried to erase the considerable work that earlier generations of conservatives did to remake the Republican Party in their own image. A quick glance at the political landscape of the mid-19th century shows how drastically the two parties changed. Geographically, the political map of the 1860s largely inverted our own. Republicans ruled New England and the West Coast. Democrats dominated the South. Ideologically, the parties inverted as well. Republicans embraced economic liberalism and federal power. Democrats championed states' rights. The line between the parties was clearest when it came to race. Republicans opposed slavery as a founding principle of the party, championed emancipation in the Civil War, and advanced an aggressive agenda to secure black freedom and Reconstruction. Democrats, in contrast, committed to the successive causes of white supremacy, slavery, secession, and segregation. Given this stark split, racial conflicts mirrored partisan ones. When the Ku Klux Klan formed in the late 1860s, Southern Democrats predictably embraced it while Republicans recoiled. This bright line soon blurred. Republicans who sent nearly 24 African Americans to Congress in the late 19th century relaxed their commitment to racial equality as the 20th century began. Southern Democrats still led the way in entrenching disfranchisement and discrimination, but Northern Republicans now offered tacit acceptance or explicit approval. Southern states constructed racial segregation under Democratic rule, for instance, but every Republican on the Supreme Court, save one, sanctioned that system in Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896. Likewise, when Democratic legislatures purged African American voters, Republicans responded by abandoning their interracial black and tan coalitions for a new lily-white movement. By the early decades of the 20th century, Republicans and Democrats each had made peace with white supremacy. Notably, when the Klan revived in the 1920s, the second version found supporters in both parties, Democrats in the South, Republicans in the Midwest. As the parties converged on race, they diverged elsewhere. By the 1920s, the GOP had abandoned the economic radicalism of its founding generation and the trust-busting of Theodore Roosevelt's progressive Republicans and embraced corporations and economic conservatism. The Great Depression pushed Democrats in a new direction too, as Franklin D. Roosevelt reoriented his party to the big government liberalism that Republicans had abandoned. Importantly, however, FDR's brand of liberalism was narrowly economic. Although some New Dealers were racially liberal, Democrats as a whole were decidedly not. Southern Democrats controlled powerful committees in Congress and used that influence to protect their own interest, especially on matters of race. Despite segregationist strength in Democratic circles, a majority of African Americans switched parties in the 1930s. Black voters had remained loyal to the party of Lincoln, even through Hoover's re-election campaign. But once they benefited from FDR's New Deal, many voted accordingly. The switch here was abrupt. In 1932, Roosevelt received only 23% of the black vote. In 1936, he received 71%. Regardless of their votes for a Democratic president, many still formally remained Republicans. In 1936, 44% of black voters registered as Democrats and 37% as Republicans. In 1940 and 1944, black registrations were evenly split. When African Americans entered the party, white Southerners saw it slipping away. The catering by our national party to the Negro vote, Senator Josiah Bailey of North Carolina noted, is very alarming to me. As they panicked, segregationists found themselves stripped of tools to stop the change. At their 1936 convention, Democrats abandoned a long-standing rule requiring presidential and vice presidential nominees to receive at least two-thirds of the delegates' votes, which had given the South a regional veto. In the 1938 primaries, the shift in power came into focus, as Roosevelt backed liberal challengers to three conservative Southern senators. All three incumbents survived, but FDR's purge attempt sparked concerns about the region's future. The South, Virginia's Senator Carter Glass wrote, would better begin thinking whether it will continue to cast its 152 electoral votes according to the memories of the Reconstruction era of 1865 and thereafter, or will have spirit and courage enough to face the new Reconstruction era that Northern so-called Democrats are menacing us with. Alarmed by this new Democratic Party, white Southerners looked across the aisle. In 1937, Bailey joined Michigan Republican Arthur Vandenberg in drafting the Conservative Manifesto, a clear articulation of limited government principles shared across party lines. In the next session, a bipartisan coalition of 30 senators prevented FDR from pressing ahead with a new wave of economic and social reforms, stopping the New Deal in its tracks. This successful partnership convinced Republicans that their Southern colleagues would come their way eventually. I have no doubt, Vandenberg said, that the realignment must occur. For another decade, the Democratic coalition awkwardly balanced segregationists with African Americans and white liberals. The tipping point came in 1948, when President Harry Truman endorsed recommendations of his Commission on Civil Rights, and liberals seized the moment to push an aggressive civil rights program at their convention. The time has arrived, Minneapolis Mayor Hubert H. Humphrey declared there, for the Democratic Party to get out of the shadow of states' rights and walk forthrightly into the bright sunshine of human rights. A plank endorsing Truman's civil rights program passed narrowly, prompting delegates from Mississippi and Alabama to storm out. Political observers were stunned. As Time put it, The South had been kicked in the pants, turned around, and kicked in the stomach. Days later, thousands of Southern Democrats gathered for another convention in Birmingham to launch the states' rights Democratic Party, commonly called the Dixiecrats. Governor Strom Thurmond of South Carolina was nominated for president, and Governor Fielding Wright of Mississippi for vice president. In his acceptance speech, Thurmond complained that white Southerners had been stabbed in the back by a president who has betrayed every principle of the Democratic Party in his desire to win at any cost. Despite a call for region-wide rebellion, the Dixiecrats couldn't capture the South. Indeed, Thurmond would win only 4 states: Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and South Carolina. Notably, these were the only states where his allies managed to block Truman from the ballot and replace him with Thurmond as the Democratic nominee. Elsewhere, Loyalists kept the president in the top spot, delivering party-line ballots to him. As he held on to most of the South, Truman also won 77% of the black vote nationwide, more than Roosevelt ever had. African Americans delivered the margin of victory for Truman in swing states and thus the election. Civil rights now stood as a decisive campaign issue. The year 1948 brought a different reckoning for Republicans. The party had now lost 5 straight presidential elections and had controlled Congress for only 2 years out of 16. Despite having a more aggressive stance on civil rights, Republicans had actually lost ground with black voters. This realization prompted some Republicans to look to the South, which the National Party had neglected for generations. In his classic 1949 study of Southern politics, V.O. Key observed that the GOP was so threadbare in the region that it scarcely deserves the name of party. Nevertheless, some believed a Republican revival could be forged through concerted appeals to the disaffected Dixiecrats. J. Harvey Williams, a North Carolinian, spent 1949 fundraising for a citizens' political committee that would spark political realignment by strengthening the coalition of conservatives. A more formal alliance between Republicans and Southern Democrats, he noted, would inspire white, English-speaking stocks to elect a conservative president. Others went further. Ohio Senator John W. Bricker, the 1944 vice presidential nominee, urged Republican and Dixiecrat leaders to coordinate realignment, so voters may have a chance to decide whether they believe in all this big government, high taxes, and profligate spending, or believe in conservation of resources, of human energy, and opportunity for the individual. Liberal Democrats welcomed these proposals. Minnesota Senator Hubert Humphrey encouraged the thinning ranks of progressive Republicans to become Democrats so that the remainder of the Republican Party could join in holy wedlock with the Dixiecrats, thereby making legal the illicit marriage which now exists. The strongest case for a Republican Dixiecrat coalition came from Senator Carl Mundt of South Dakota. Seeking permanent realignment of party forces in this country, Mundt crisscrossed America on a years-long campaign of public lectures, radio interviews, and television appearances. Mundt's proposal for a merger of the Republicans and Southern Democrats is the most intriguing and perhaps the most promising party reorganization development, enthused the St. Louis Globe-Democrat. The South proved especially excited. Not mere applause, the Jackson, Mississippi Daily News reported after an April 1951 visit, but ear-splitting rebel yells, the kind heard in political gatherings in this state 70 years ago. In July, Mundt debated Representative Clifford Case, a liberal Republican from New Jersey, in the pages of Collier's. The question, should the GOP merge with the Dixiecrats? Mundt argued that Republicans' string of defeats demanded a new strategy. We have tried to echo Democratic appeals to minority and pressure groups, but this hasn't worked. We have tried just about everything except an alliance with the South. Whites there had closer political kinship with Republicans than with Democrats. There is no chance for Southern Democrats to recapture their party. It is irrevocably committed to a viewpoint that is not Southern, and to non-Southern interest groups. In any case, he added, realignment had already begun. The Republican and Democratic parties have exchanged positions about the functions of states. Once state rights was the battle cry of Democrats, now it is a Republican tenet of faith. I am convinced it is still close to the hearts of Southern Democrats. Case insisted that Munt's merger plan would never work because Southern Democrats in Congress would have to forfeit their prized committee chairmanships and, as a result, their power. But more fundamentally, Case warned that abandoning civil rights would be a betrayal of our heritage. Despite objections from liberals and moderates, Republican leaders courted Dixiecrats in 1952. Our friends called themselves states' writers, and we call ourselves Republicans, RNC Chairman Guy Gabrielson noted in an appeal in Alabama, but such labels were meaningless. The Dixiecrat Party believes in states' rights. That's what the Republican Party believes in. The shift in emphasis was evident at the convention, which adopted a milder civil rights plank than previous conventions. We believe that it is the primary responsibility of each state to order and control its own domestic institutions, it read, allowing that the federal government might take supplemental action. Headlines that summer in the black-owned Atlanta Daily World highlighted the contrast. States' rights position on civil rights in GOP platform, and Democratic Party nails down strong civil rights plank. This GOP message enticed Dixiecrats, and so did the presidential nominee, Dwight D. Eisenhower. Leaders of the Dixiecrat revolt in Alabama and Louisiana, former state party chairman Gessner McCorvey and political boss Leander Perez, respectively, had been early backers of Eisenhower, but other prominent Dixiecrats soon lined up. Walter Sillars, Speaker of the Mississippi House and Chairman of the Dixiecrat Convention, supported Eisenhower. In South Carolina, 3 prominent Dixiecrats also backed Ike: Congressman Mendel Rivers, Governor Jimmy Burns, and Senator Strom Thurmond, the 1948 Dixiecrat presidential nominee. The Republican campaign welcomed their support. In Birmingham, the Dixiecrats' national treasurer introduced Eisenhower at a rally. In Miami, a leading Florida Dixiecrat did the same. The 1952 drive for the Deep South came up short, but Republicans still made inroads. Throughout the Deep South, but especially in Georgia, South Carolina, and Mississippi, Carrie Fredrickson concluded, there was a strong correlation between counties that supported the Dixiecrats and those that endorsed Eisenhower, showing that the Dixiecrat movement had effectively loosened the moorings of Southern political allegiance at the national level. Meanwhile, Eisenhower succeeded in the peripheral South, taking Virginia, Tennessee, Florida, Oklahoma, and Texas largely by winning over moderate, middle-class whites in metropolitan regions. Beyond the presidency, however, Republicans' Southern gains were limited because of a narrow focus on the top. Do not try to sell the Republican Party to Southern voters, a GOP memo advised. Sell Eisenhower. The nominee never stumped for congressional candidates. Accordingly, only 6 Southern Republicans won House races, 5 in mountain districts along the Tennessee-Virginia border, and a 6th in central Virginia. In 1954, the party lost a mountain seat but gained 2 seats in Dallas and Tampa. As these moderate Republicans gained ground, ex-Dixiecrats floundered. In 1954, 2 former activists in the revolt, Alabama's Tom Abernathy and Florida's Tom Watson, won Republican gubernatorial nominations by promising to preserve segregation. Both improved considerably on past GOP performances. Abernathy won 27%, Watson 20%, but not enough to win. Moderation, it seemed, might be the clearest path to success in the South. The Civil Rights Revolution quickly upended that logic. The Supreme Court's Brown decision, authored by Republican Chief Justice Earl Warren, gave segregationists second thoughts about Republicans' newfound talk of states' rights. Personally, Eisenhower loathed the decision, grumbling that Warren's appointment was the biggest damn fool mistake I ever made, and dismissing suggestions that he announced support for Brown or tour the South to urge compliance. 3 years later, he finally intervened in Little Rock, but only after his presidential authority had been challenged. President Eisenhower was a fine general and a good, decent man, remembered the NAACP's Roy Wilkins. But if he had fought World War II the way he fought for civil rights, we would all be speaking German today. That said, Democrats were no better. Illinois Governor Adlai Stevenson, Eisenhower's opponent in 1952 and 1956, likewise tried to sidestep the subject, for he also sought votes from segregationists and African Americans alike. But Southern Republicans couldn't avoid the issue. After Brown, no new Republican candidates won Southern congressional seats for the rest of the decade, and those already in office increasingly joined their Democratic colleagues in massive resistance to desegregation. In 1956, for instance, 2 of the region's 7 House Republicans signed the Southern Manifesto, urging states to fight federal integration orders. In 1957, 5 of the 7 petitioned Eisenhower to withdraw troops from Little Rock, fearing that the intervention would cause the destruction of the Republican Party in the South. In Dallas, once moderate Representative Bruce Alger embraced segregation in his 1956 re-election campaign. When his opponent blamed Republicans for Brown, Alger noted that 7 of the 9 justices in that case had been appointed by Democrats, while Plessy had been written by a Republican and backed by almost every Republican then on the court. The segregationist doctrine of separate but equal, Alger argued with pride, came from a Republican ruling. He won the race. Importantly, this rightward turn for Southern Republicans happened just as the National Party finally devoted resources to the region. In 1957, RNC Chairman Meade Alcorn complained that most Southern states had no Republican organization, no office, no staff, no telephone, no program of party action, no effort to develop candidates, no effort to do anything. Accordingly, he launched Operation Dixie, creating a Southern division at the RNC and dedicating more funding to recruit leaders and build up infrastructure. Eisenhower hoped that this would enable the party to repeat the moderates' successes of the early 1950s, but its timing, right during the Little Rock crisis, only helped reactionary forces take hold. In Mississippi, for instance, the RNC replaced its long-standing moderate leader, African-American Perry Howard, with Wirt Yerger, the head of a lily-white organization who promised to build the Mississippi GOP into a vehicle for conservatives who felt estranged from the National Democratic Party. As Southern Republicans veered right, the National Party wavered. Vice President Richard Nixon secured the 1960 presidential nomination only after making concessions to New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller, leader of the GOP's liberal wing. More progressive than Eisenhower on civil rights, Nixon welcomed a return to the party's tradition of racial equality. Accordingly, a lengthy civil rights plank in the 1960 platform called for federal intervention on several fronts, a bold stance that Nixon believed would give him an edge in the election. But when Nixon lost on that platform, conservatives urged Republicans to turn right and look south. Their theory, Rockefeller's aide related, is that by becoming more reactionary than even the Southern Democratic Party, the Republican Party can attract Southern conservatives who have been Democrats, and by consolidating them with conservative strength in the Middle West and Far West, the Republicans can offset the liberalism of the Northeast and finally prevail. The strategy was gaining adherents, the aide added. Barry has been falling increasingly for it. Indeed, Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater had been a trailblazer. As early as 1953, he noted privately that the dictates of the stronger minority groups are felt in almost every decision Democrats make, in almost every debate they enter. Conservative white Southerners were losing their ancestral home. I sense here a realignment. In 1959, he toured the South, impressing segregationists with his insistence that court-ordered desegregation represented an abuse of federal power. Headlining the Republican convention in South Carolina, Goldwater declared that Brown should not be enforced by arms, because it was not based on law. In a radio interview with the segregationist White Citizens Council, the Arizonan belittled so-called liberals who are so vitally interested in civil rights, and insisted that states' rights is the cornerstone, the keystone of our whole constitutional republic. Nixon's defeat the following year moved Goldwater's argument mainstream. In a post-mortem meeting with Nixon and Kentucky Senator Thurston Morton, chairman of the RNC, Eisenhower complained that "We have made civil rights a main part of our effort these past 8 years, but we have lost Negro support instead of increasing it." Nixon agreed, calling African Americans a bought vote, beyond their reach. RNC Chairman Morton summed up the mood. The hell with them. In 1961, the Republican National Committee intensified its Southern outreach. Its new chairman, conservative Representative William Miller of New York, made the Southern Division a priority, devoting $500,000, roughly a third of his annual budget, to Operation Dixie. Party chairs and vice chairs were established in 87% of Southern counties by 1964, but only because of a readiness to recruit segregationists. Former RNC Chairman Al Corn later remembered that the program's whole purpose was perverted, as new leaders took over the Operation Dixie machinery and attempted to convert it into a lily-white organization. They did succeed in some states, I'm sorry to say. But conservatives welcomed this change. In June 1961, William Loeb, influential publisher of the Manchester Union Leader, urged Republicans to ignore the Negro vote in the North and focus on whites. By being the white man's party, they can definitely become the majority party of the white man in the South, he noted. In this way, we will have finally brought the conservative and the states' writers in the North and South together in the Republican Party. At the RNC's first gathering of Southern leaders that fall, Goldwater insisted that white conservatives represented Republicans' best hope. "We're not going to get the Negro vote as a bloc in 1964 and 1968, he famously announced. "So we ought to go hunting where the ducks are." An emerging generation of Southern Republicans revealed what this meant. In Texas, a 1961 special election for the Senate seat vacated by Lyndon Johnson resulted in the surprising victory of John Tower. An outspoken critic of desegregation mandates, Tower had bemoaned federal intervention in Little Rock and led the fight against civil rights at the 1960 convention. In the Senate, Tower would make common cause with segregationist Democrats, voting against both the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But even before those votes, his election, as the first Southern Republican in the Senate since Reconstruction, showed that the segregationist vote was up for grabs. In South Carolina, Republicans recruited segregationist William D. Workman, Jr. for the 1962 Senate race. A newspaper columnist and television commentator, Workman had recently published A Case for the South, which urged massive resistance to desegregation. Campaigning beneath Confederate flags, he argued that incumbent Senator Olin Johnston was simply incapable of defending the Southern way of life as a Democrat. Workman, who abandoned that party as it turned to civil rights, likened himself to the Dixiecrats, who had also been driven from the house of their fathers. Meanwhile, in Alabama, Democrat James D. Martin switched parties to run against Senator Lister Hill, who he likewise claimed was soft on integration. When he accepted the Republican nomination, Martin called for a return to the spirit of 1861, when our fathers formed a new nation. God willing, we will not again be forced to take up the rifle and the bayonet to preserve these principles. Both made strong showings. Workman won 43%, while Martin took 49%, nearly unseating an entrenched incumbent. Republicans were encouraged by the results. "I like to fish when the tide's coming in. That's when the fish bite," explained Operation Dixie's Head. And the tide is coming in now in the South. Accordingly, the GOP kept recruiting segregationist Democrats. The next year, in Mississippi, for instance, the Republican candidates for governor and lieutenant governor were Rubel Phillips, former Democratic chairman of the Mississippi Public Service Commission, and Stanford Morse, a Democratic state senator. They embodied the state GOP, which was, a reporter noted, composed largely of former Democrats. Campaign material promoted Phillips as a staunch segregationist who condemns the use of federal power or threats of reprisals to force integration on Mississippians to curry favor with minority voters on the big northern and eastern cities. He took nearly 40% of the vote, showing again that segregationist Republicans could compete in the Deep South. As Republicans welcomed segregationists, political observers took note. Liberal columnist Joseph Alsop scolded the GOP for embracing what he called the Southern strategy. "Closed doors are desirable for a discussion of the Southern strategy," he noted in 1962, "because it is basically a segregationist strategy. The ugly word will not be used, of course. Powerful admiration for states' rights will be professed instead. But this amounts to the same thing." What journalists discovered behind those closed doors alarmed them. In 1963, syndicated columnist Robert Novak attended the RNC summer meeting in Denver. Over breakfast, one operative reminded colleagues, "This isn't South Africa. The white man outnumbers the Negro 9-1 in this country." At lunch, two Southern chairmen casually used racial slurs. The amazing part of it, an Easterner marveled, was that nobody criticized them for doing it. Wirt Yerger, head of the GOP's Association of Southern State Chairmen, even accused the Kennedy administration of fomenting racial trouble to win elections. All this pointed to an unmistakable conclusion, Novak noted. A good many, perhaps a majority of the party's leaders envisioned substantial political gold to be mined in the racial crisis by becoming, in fact, though not in name, the white man's party. The 1964 election provided, at long last, a stark contrast on civil rights. President Lyndon B. Johnson had long been a typical Southern Democrat, consistently voting against civil rights measures during his first 20 years in Congress. But as his national ambitions grew, he embraced the cause, helping pass the Civil Rights Acts of 1957 and 1960 as Senate Majority Leader. As president, Johnson devoted himself to strengthening Kennedy's Civil Rights Bill and overcoming Southern resistance. Underscoring his commitment to the issue, LBJ tapped Hubert Humphrey, Democrats' longtime trailblazer on civil rights, as his running mate. Meanwhile, the Republican ticket was the Southern strategy personified. Goldwater won the nomination and picked RNC Chairman William Miller as his vice presidential nominee. Alabama Governor George Wallace, a segregationist Democrat, offered to switch parties if Goldwater would make him his running mate, but the Arizonan thought that was a step too far. The 1964 Republican National Convention displayed the party's reinvention. Liberals and moderates who had dominated for decades now found themselves on the outside. The moderate Ripon Society insisted that the party had to choose whether or not to adopt a strategy that must inevitably exploit the white backlash to the civil rights movement. The convention's verdict was clear. The 1964 party platform, columnist Roland Evans and Robert Novak reported, had the weakest Republican civil rights plank in memory. The 1960 platform had devoted 1,250 words to a detailed civil rights plank. The 1964 plank was 1/10 as long and, as one newspaper put it, weak and weasel-worded. Nelson Rockefeller, who had pushed the prior convention to embrace civil rights, tried to add an amendment denouncing extremists in the John Birch Society and the KKK, but was shouted down. Notably, the convention floor was mostly white. For the first time in 50 years, there were no black delegates in any Southern delegation. Even polyglot California somehow sent no Negroes and no Jews, Evans and Novak marveled. The few black Republicans who attended were verbally abused and physically assaulted. One had his suit set on fire. His attacker screamed, "Keep in your own place." Longtime Republican Jackie Robinson left the convention deeply shaken. "I now believe I know how it felt to be a Jew in Hitler's Germany." As blacks recoiled from the GOP, white Southerners warmed to it. Goldwater led the way, making pointed appeals for party switching. "There is nothing left of the principles that your fathers, grandfathers, and great-grandfathers stood for in the Democratic Party," he assured a massive audience in South Carolina. "I wonder how many votes Hubert Horatio Humphrey would have gotten in the Deep South of your fathers and grandfathers." The campaign for party switchers climaxed with the announcement in September 1964 that Senator Strom Thurmond, the archetypical Dixiecrat, was leaving the Democratic Party and officially joining the GOP. This was no surprise, newspapers yawned, as he had long sided with Republicans. There is not enough difference between a conservative South Carolina Democrat like Senator Thurmond and a conservative Republican to put a piece of paper between, Goldwater had told Southern audiences. But working across the aisle was one thing, and moving there quite another. Southern Democrats had considered switching since the 1930s, but always found reasons to stay put. Republicans' reputation for racial liberalism, long a sticking point, had faded, but career congressmen still balked because their power derived from two simple facts. Democrats had solid majorities in Congress, and within the party, Southern congressmen had seniority, which gave them prestigious committee chairs. Switching parties would have meant starting over at the very bottom, as junior members of the minority party. None seemed willing to surrender one iota of seniority or other senatorial perquisites in the Congress. Thurmond's chief of staff later explained, "This is why so few party switches take place. Conservative columnist William F. Buckley Jr. accordingly urged Republicans to be generous with Strom Thurmond. If the perks of his seniority were protected, it would establish an enticing precedent, and 6 or possibly 8, conceivably 10 Democratic senators could be persuaded to move in a block to the Republican side of the aisle. Republicans were indeed generous with Thurmond, but the sweetheart deal they struck was understood to be a one-off. As a result, other segregationist senators closed out their careers as Democrats. Outside Congress, party switching was more common. In Houston, 2,000 registered Democrats, including 40 precinct workers, gathered for a mass resignation rally to announce their switch. In Illinois, a Republican precinct worker announced his switch the other way, rationalizing that the two major parties have changed sides in 100 years. Goldwater suffered a landslide loss that year. Aside from Arizona, he carried only 5 states, all of them in the Deep South: South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. But his impact there was remarkable. Goldwater won a smashing victory in Mississippi, the Jackson Clarion Ledger reported, becoming the first Republican to win the state since Grant won it with the aid of Reconstruction bayonets. He took 87% of Mississippi's vote, winning every county. His coattails helped a little-known candidate oust a 22-year Democratic congressman, and surely would have done more if Republicans had only bothered to run candidates everywhere. Their oversight was naive and stupid, one activist regretted. In Alabama, Goldwater did nearly as well, winning 70%. Here, though, state officials had anticipated his strength and prepared to profit down ballot. The Barry Goldwater tidal wave, the Birmingham News reported, swept Republicans into office at every level from constable to Congress. To be sure, Goldwater's impact was clearest in this new class of Southern Republican congressmen. Prentice Walker, the first Mississippi Republican representative in 80 years, was a former Democratic official and ardent segregationist. Unsubtly, his first public address after winning came before a Klan front called Americans for the Preservation of the White Race. In Alabama, segregationist Bill Dickinson likewise left the Democrats and won a House seat as a Republican. "I have joined the white man's party," he announced upon switching. "It behooves us to support those who support us and our way of life." The other 4 Republican congressmen from Alabama, including Jim Martin bouncing back from his narrow loss in 1962, were similarly outspoken opponents of civil rights. One said that the Civil Rights Act paved the way for the destruction of our liberties. Another called the day that it passed Black Friday. Howard Bo Calloway, who likewise abandoned Democrats over integration and promised to repeal the Civil Rights Act, became Georgia's first Republican representative since Reconstruction. In South Carolina, Democratic Congressman Albert Watson had campaigned for Goldwater, prompting House Democrats to strip his seniority. Watson resigned from Congress, switched parties, and reclaimed his seat with 70% of the vote. Regardless of party, Watson remained a solid segregationist, voting against the Civil Rights Act as a Democrat and against the Voting Rights Act as a Republican. Most of his Southern colleagues did too. So goes the GOP in the South, an Atlanta columnist noted in 1965, with its crop of freshmen in Congress sounding just as Democrats and Dixiecrats have sounded for these many years. Importantly, the nation now saw the two parties starkly divided on racial matters. In 1962, a survey asking whether Democrats or Republicans were more likely to see to it that Negroes get fair treatment in jobs and housing showed Americans evenly split. 23% said Democrats and 21% said Republicans. but a solid majority of 56% saw the two parties as basically the same. Just 2 years later, public opinion had shifted dramatically. In 1964, 60% said Democrats were likelier to back civil rights measures in employment. 33% said the parties were little different, and only 7% said Republicans had the edge. Likewise, on the question of which party was likelier to support school desegregation, 56% picked Democrats, 37% said neither had an edge, and once again, only 7% said Republicans. The clearest sign of realignment on racial issues, of course, came from African Americans themselves. Well after the New Deal made most black voters Democrats, roughly a third remained Republicans. In 1956, Eisenhower won 39% of the black vote. In 1960, Nixon took 32%. Yet in 1964, Goldwater received only 6%. Although the election was transformative, the permanence of those transformations wasn't yet clear. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 promised to remake the electorate and, quite possibly, the electoral map. In its first year of operation alone, the number of African Americans registered in the Deep South doubled. Given the 1964 patterns, observers expected new black voters to vote Democratic too. But how their rise would reshape politics in the South and elsewhere remained an open question. Would there be a white backlash in 1966? If so, polls suggested that it would benefit Republicans. When the Harris survey asked, which party in the next few years would do a better job slowing down the pace of civil rights, 69% said Republicans, 31% Democrats. The 1966 election gave a mixed verdict on the power of white backlash. In the South, reactionary politics drove both parties right, as 3 Republican House freshmen took on prominent Democratic segregationists. Prentice Walker challenged Senator Jim Eastland in the Mississippi Senate race. Jim Martin faced Lurleen Wallace, defending Alabama's gubernatorial seat as a surrogate for her husband, George. And Bo Calloway ran for Georgia governor against Lester Maddox, an Atlanta businessman who shut down his restaurant rather than desegregate it. All 3 Republicans lost. Calloway actually won the popular vote, but the close election was thrown to the Georgia House, where the Democratic majority backed the Democrat. Even with those departures from the House, Southern Republicans doubled their numbers, from 14 to 28. Outside the region, though, the potential of backlash politics remained uncertain. Gubernatorial races in California and Florida, won by Democrats turned Republicans, Ronald Reagan and Claude Kirk, were both influenced by the backlash, the Los Angeles Times observed. But in Arkansas and Maryland, Democrats running reactionary campaigns lost to moderate Republicans. In Massachusetts, African-American Edward Brooke won election to the Senate as a Republican. The future of the GOP was unclear. What the 1966 elections did make clear was the return of Richard Nixon. Hoping to build support for his next presidential run, Nixon spent the year campaigning for Republican congressional candidates, paying special attention to the South. Because of its strong showing for Goldwater, the region had been rewarded with additional seats for the next Republican National Convention, enough to control nearly half the votes needed for the nomination. Stumping for Southern Republicans in 1966, Nixon repeated Goldwater's call for conservatives to switch sides. The Democratic Party at the national level hasn't been conservative for 30 years and never will be, he insisted in Birmingham. So get out of it and join the Republican Party. Nixon tried to dodge discussion of segregation, although state parties often made that impossible. In 1964, for instance, the Mississippi GOP formally endorsed segregation of the races as absolutely essential to harmonious race relations. Asked about it during a 1966 visit, Nixon insisted that he was opposed to any so-called segregationist plank in a Republican platform. Meanwhile, in South Carolina, the moderate leadership had been replaced in 1965 by Thurman's aide, Harry Dent, who switched parties with his boss. Any major Republican you meet in the state is likely as not to be a former Democrat, a newspaper explained in what was now a routine observation. The 1966 South Carolina Republican Convention, held beneath a huge Confederate banner, had no black delegates. Its gubernatorial candidate, a former Democratic state representative, called the incumbent soft on segregation. When Nixon came to raise funds for this new South Carolina GOP, a reporter asked if it was awkward to be associated with old states' right Strom. Undeterred, Nixon vouched for Thurman's character. Strom is no racist. Strom is a man of courage and integrity. Nixon and Thurman's alliance proved pivotal. In the next 2 years, Harry Dent remembered, the seed of the Republican Southern strategy began to sprout and grow. Looking ahead to 1968, Thurman and Dent locked down Southern Republicans for Nixon, setting up an Atlanta meeting with Southern Party chairmen. Nixon avoided supporting segregation openly, but his promises, conservative judicial appointments, relaxed enforcement of school desegregation, and opposition to busing, won them over. At the Miami Convention, Nixon provided more assurances to Southern conservatives, especially his selection of Maryland Governor Spiro Agnew as running mate. Elected as a moderate, Agnew gained fame lambasting civil rights leaders after a riot. Meanwhile, the Republican platform never even mentioned the phrase civil rights. There were instead extensive calls for law and order, which Nixon protested in his acceptance speech was not a code word for racism. Taken together, Alsop observed, the words and acts quite clearly mean that Nixon will follow the Southern strategy this year. But there was not a single Southern strategy, and Nixon's plan was not a simple rehash of Goldwater's. The idea that Goldwater started the Southern strategy is bullshit, Nixon later fumed to a biographer. The GOP had already made inroads under Eisenhower, but Goldwater overreached by chasing foam-at-the-mouth segregationists. The Arizonan ran as a racist candidate, Nixon argued, and therefore won the wrong Southern states, sweeping the Deep South but alienating the rest. Nixon believed Goldwater's approach was generally flawed, but especially ill-suited to 1968. Segregationist Democrat George Wallace, running as an independent, seemed sure to sweep the Deep South. Accordingly, Nixon ceded that ground, focusing on winning the rest of the region. A memo from Mississippian Fred LaRue spelled out this Southern strategy. The anti-Wallace message will be indirect, between the lines, and in regional code words. Dent handled the details, although Nixon held off on officially hiring Thurman's aide until after the election. As he stressed similarities with Wallace to white Southerners, Nixon emphasized differences elsewhere, using the segregationist to seem statesmanlike by comparison. Still, when it came to Wallace's and Nixon's challenges to the civil rights movement, these were differences of degree, not kind. Sociologist Jonathan Ryder has aptly invoked the strategies that anti-communists proposed for the Cold War. If Wallace offered rollback, Nixon suggested containment. Nixon's plan worked. Wallace took only 5 Deep South states, while LBJ's Texas stayed Democratic. Nixon captured the rest of the South, which, along with the Midwest and West, won him the election. Having narrowly won a three-way race, Nixon sought to solidify the South for 1972. The Southern strategy was just pure election politics, remembered Clark Reed, chairman of the Mississippi GOP. The South was going for Wallace, and Nixon could get it next time. Publicly, Nixon's aides repeatedly denied they had any Southern strategy, hoping to maintain the middle-of-the-road image they had drawn between the segregationist Wallace and the liberal Humphrey. To maintain that illusion, Nixon aide John Ehrlichman noted, the administration strategically took a range of stances on civil rights issues, adding liberal zigs to balance conservative zags. But the zags were there nonetheless. The Attorney General's testimony against renewal of the Voting Rights Act, an appeal for desegregation delays in Mississippi, and, most important, the nomination of two Southern conservatives to the Supreme Court. Political rhetoric backed up policies, with Dent orchestrating the plan and Agnew serving, one journalist noted, as chief agent of the president's Southern strategy. Despite their denials, Nixon's administration soon confirmed the Southern strategy. In the fall of 1969, Kevin Phillips, a campaign strategist and special assistant to Attorney General John Mitchell, published The Emerging Republican Majority. In it, he observed that the old liberal Democratic coalition was being surpassed by a new conservative Republican one, rooted in suburbia and the South and the Southwest, which he christened the Sun Belt. The principal cause of the breakup of the New Deal coalition, Phillips stated bluntly, was the Negro problem. Counterintuitively, he argued that Republicans should back the Voting Rights Act because it would only accelerate the process of party realignment. The more Negroes who register as Democrats in the South, the sooner the negrophobe whites will quit the Democrats and become Republicans, he informed the New York Times. That's where the votes are. Wallace's independent run had merely represented a way station for Democratic traditionalists following party realignment into the Republican Party. Phillips confidently predicted that we'll get 2/3 to 3/4 of the Wallace vote in 1972. The emerging Republican majority panicked the administration. Speechwriter William Safire warned it was the most dangerous new book to come out, not because it was wrong about Republicans looking south, but because it suggested they would write off the Northeast in doing so. To blunt the book's impact, Safire urged Dent to pooh-pooh it and urged Nixon to deny having read it. Both did exactly that. In a December 1969 memo, re Southern Strategy and the Northeast, Dent exhorted Nixon to reframe Southern outreach so we effectively get across the point that nobody is being written out, the South is only being written in. Publicly, the GOP followed that exact line. The Southern strategy is a bum rap, RNC Chairman Rogers Morton told reporters. Republicans were pursuing the South, but the suggestion that Nixon might ignore other regions was a deeply cynical view of the office of the presidency. Although the administration insisted that the Southern strategy had been exaggerated, privately it worried that the strategy had not gone far enough. In January 1970, Dent warned that George Wallace has a counter-Southern strategy to deny Southern electoral votes to the president in 1972. Journalists likewise saw Nixon and Wallace competing for the same Southern white votes. At the 1970 Gridiron Dinner, for instance, the president was treated to a song titled "Rock-a-bye Your Baby with a Dixie Melody," whose lyrics included the lines, "Rock-a-bye the voters with a Southern strategy. Don't you fuss, we won't bust children in old Dixie. We'll put George Wallace in decline below the Mason-Dixon line. A zillion Southern votes we will deliver. Move Washington down on the Swanee River. Rockabye with old Massa Nixon and his Dixie strategy. Nixon and Agnew played along with the joke during their own performance, engaging in banter behind pianos on stage. "What about this Southern strategy we hear so often?" Nixon asked his vice president. "Yes, sir, Mr. President," Agnew answered in exaggerated dialect. "I agree with you completely on your Southern strategy." Worried about being outflanked by Wallace, the administration backed arch-conservative Republicans in the 1970 midterms. In South Carolina, Representative Albert Watson ran for the governor's office in a starkly racist campaign. One of his first television ads depicted black rioters in Los Angeles asking, "Are we going to be ruled by the bloc? Only thing folks are talking about is if the colored are going to run our schools, or we are," a white truck driver told a reporter. "For my money, only one man is standing up for white folks, and that's Albert Watson." Meanwhile, Florida Governor Claude Kirk tried to hold his seat with delays on public school integration and complete resistance to forced busing. Kirk pressed racial resentment so hard that the editor of the Gainesville Sun had to ask, does he want re-election so badly that he will pull a George Wallace and split Florida's people asunder? When Watson and Kirk both lost their races to more racially moderate Democrats, many concluded that they and the Nixon administration had overplayed their hand. New York Times reporter R.W. Apple scoffed that 1970 was the year of the non-emerging Republican majority. Having gone too far in the midterms, Nixon's team recalibrated for 1972. Returning to its 1968 plan of backing conservative policies while disavowing extremist politics. "It is not a Southern strategy," Nixon insisted. "It is an American strategy. That is what it is, and that is what the South believes in and what America believes in." In noting that Southern appeals worked well across the nation, the president was wholly right. Nixon won a landslide re-election, taking in 60.7% of the popular vote. He won every state of the Confederacy, the first time a Republican ever did that, and by commanding margins. Indeed, the South was Nixon's strongest region. Across America, Nixon won over 70% of the vote in 8 states. 6 of them were in the South. He did best in Mississippi, winning 79%. He won roughly 80% of the white vote across the South, an estimated 92% from rural whites in the Deep South. Voters who had opted for Wallace in 1968 swung to Nixon by a 3-to-1 margin, just as Phillips had predicted. In many ways, the Republican and Democratic parties are exchanging their historic roles and constituencies, the strategist crowed. The Republicans are becoming the presidential party of the old Confederacy, while the Democrats are beginning to pivot on the Northeast, Upper Midwest, and Pacific Northwest, virtually reversing the old post-Civil War pattern. Dent believed this realignment was permanent. The South will never go back. Though significant, this shift in voters' presidential preference was simply the first stage in regional realignment. Typically, changes in local, state, and congressional preferences follow presidential shifts, but at a slower pace. Republicans hoped to speed the process, Dent noted to Nixon, by encouraging more switchovers throughout the South. They had some successes. In 1968, 5 top Democratic officeholders in Georgia became Republicans at once. State legislators switched parties there and elsewhere, too. Negotiations to get Georgia's governor, Lester Maddox, to turn Republican fell apart, but another former segregationist, Virginia's Governor Mills Godwin, changed parties as a prelude to his successful return to that office in 1973. Former Texas Governor John Connally, who joined Nixon's cabinet in 1971 as a rumored replacement for Agnew, switched parties in 1973 as well. The GOP Southern strategy, Phillips gloated again, seems to be rolling along and rolling up local victories. In Congress, however, a mass defection of conservative Southern Democrats remained a pipe dream. In its first term, the Nixon administration championed Project Okinawa, an attempt to lure Senator Harry Byrd, Jr., head of Virginia's Democratic machine, into the Republican ranks. Byrd did leave the Democrats after the 1970 election, but stopped short of joining the GOP, declaring himself an independent. In early 1972, House Minority Leader Gerald Ford hoped to boost Republican ranks through Operation Switchover, but that plan fizzled too. After Nixon's 1972 landslide, however, mass switching seemed plausible. The president's coattails produced a narrow but durable conservative majority in Congress, reflected National Review publisher William Rusher, prompting serious consideration for major realignment. Even as the National Party had moved left, Southern Democrats remained reliably on the right. In its 1972 congressional ratings, for instance, the American Conservative Union gave 8 senators a 100 for their perfectly conservative records, 5 Republicans and 3 Southern Democrats. Newspapers speculated in late 1972 that a small number might switch parties. Later reports suggested more. According to journalist Godfrey Hodgson, some 40 Democrats entered into negotiations about becoming Republicans. In early 1973, Democratic Congressman Joe Wagoner of Louisiana, a former leader of the White Citizens Councils, discussed with GOP officials under what terms Democrats would be welcomed into Republican ranks. The main obstacles, as always, were Democrats' concerns over seniority. It went committee by committee. The ranking Republican member in each case was asked whether he would be willing to stand aside and let a Democratic convert take over the chairmanship, Hodgson noted. In the end, half of those who were asked said they were willing to do just that. Before Wagoner's work could be completed, however, the Senate Watergate inquiry began, quickly making the Republican Party much less attractive for disaffected Democrats. Instead of a sudden shift, congressional realignment happened piecemeal, with older conservative Democrats being slowly replaced by younger conservative Republicans. Consider Mississippi Representative William Colmer. First elected in 1932, he had witnessed firsthand Democrats' shift from segregation to civil rights. Part of the Mississippi delegation that stormed out of the 1948 convention, he helped launch the Dixiecrat movement. Like most Dixiecrats, though, he returned to the Democrats, waging a losing battle against civil rights inside the party. By 1966, Colmer was grumbling that conservatives should leave the Democrats for good, but his seniority made him the powerful head of the House Rules Committee, so he stayed put. When he finally retired in 1972, Colmer tapped his administrative assistant, 30-year-old Trent Lott, as his replacement. Crucially, Lott ran as a Republican, with newspaper ads presenting him as a conservative in the Colmer tradition. Lott won, and over the next decades, rose through Republican ranks to become Senate Majority Leader, a position he later resigned, ironically, for praising Strom Thurmond's Dixiecrat candidacy. Most new Southern Republicans had a less direct connection to Democrats they replaced, but the general pattern held. In 1972, Mississippi Republican Thad Cochran replaced another retiring House Democrat. 6 years later, he succeeded Senator Jim Eastland. Dave Treen, a Louisiana Dixiecrat who joined the GOP in 1962, replaced another retiring Democrat that year. the state's first Republican representative since the 19th century. In 1979, Treen became its first Republican governor since Reconstruction. In North Carolina, Jesse Helms, who worked as an aide to segregationist Democratic Senator Willis Smith and served as a Democratic city councilman in Raleigh before switching parties in 1970, won election in 1972 to become the state's first Republican senator in 70 years. As with negotiations for switches by senior congressmen, this replacement process stalled with Watergate and the reckoning it brought Republicans in the 1974 and 1976 elections. But that was merely a short-term setback. As RNC Chairman George H.W. Bush predicted in 1973, the current realignment of the GOP will continue long after Watergate is forgotten. Indeed, the shift of Southern white conservatives only accelerated. Republicans' regional domination of the Nixon era was interrupted in 1976 when Democrat Jimmy Carter, a born-again Christian from Georgia, swept all of the South except Virginia. That proved a temporary reversal as Reagan retook it all, except Carter's Georgia, in 1980. Revered in the region, Reagan persuaded Southern whites to register as Republicans. Ads across the South framed switching as the only option for conservatives. I didn't leave the Democratic Party. It left me. I know what it's like to pull that Republican lever for the first time because I used to be a Democrat myself, Reagan joked. But I can tell you, it only hurts for a minute. The plea worked. Election returns showed that Southern white men who had identified as Democratic by a 4-to-1 margin 2 decades earlier now split evenly between the parties. It was, political scientist Warren Miller concluded, a realignment of massive proportions. The reasons for Reagan's success with Southern whites, however, remain contested. A former Goldwater surrogate, Reagan seemed intent on reviving that brand of Southern strategy. For his first major event after the 1980 convention, Reagan accepted Lott's invitation to come to Philadelphia, Mississippi, the infamous site where 3 civil rights activists were murdered in 1964 with the local police's complicity. I believe in states' rights, Reagan told the lily-white crowd, promising to restore to states and local governments the power that properly belongs to them. Civil rights leader Andrew Young warned that these code words have been the electoral language of Wallace, Goldwater, and the Nixon Southern strategy. Campaign surrogates such as South Carolina Congressman Carroll Campbell insisted that Reagan's invocation of states' rights had no connection to segregation. But such claims of innocence were often undermined by those surrogates' own past links to segregation. Campbell, for instance, gained fame in 1970 as spokesman for a South Carolina group working to slow school integration. He won his first election that same year. Like Nixon's administration, Reagan's denied it had any race-based Southern strategy. In 1981, strategist Lee Atwater readily admitted that racism had been the foundation for the Harry Dent-type Southern strategy. The whole strategy was based on coded racism. The whole thing. But Reagan's regional appeal was different. The South Carolinian protested because it focused on economics and national defense, and the whole campaign was devoid of any kind of racism, any kind of reference. Despite Atwater's spin, Reagan made campaign references to a Chicago welfare queen in addition to the states' rights talk across the South. But Atwater was right in another sense, for Reagan's regional appeal wasn't simply the old Southern strategy of coded racism. As political scientists Angie Maxwell and Todd Shields have noted, Too often, the Southern strategy is remembered as a fixed short course relegated to a few election cycles and singularly focused on exploiting racial animus. Instead, they argue convincingly, there was a long Southern strategy that evolved and expanded from the coded racism of the Goldwater-Nixon appeals to a broader social conservatism attuned to religious fundamentalism and family values as well. In the Reagan era, Republican campaigns blended these three themes in equal measure, delighting Southern conservatives. Trent Lott told the Sons of Confederate Veterans that the spirit of Jefferson Davis lives in the 1984 Republican platform. The GOP presidential nominee took every single Southern state in 1984, 1988, 2000, and 2004, losing only parts of the region in 1992 and 1996, when Democrats ran two white Southerners on the same ticket. The surge of Southern Republicans in Congress was equally remarkable. In 1950, there were no Southern Republican senators and only two congressmen in the South's 105-member House delegation. By 2000, the South's delegations to the House and Senate were both majority Republican. State legislators were the last to change because of the GOP's initial focus on statewide races and an according lack of grassroots investments. But the process that political scientists Christopher Cooper and Gibbs Knotts termed trickle-down realignment reached state legislatures in the 1990s and 2000s. Reviewing the first for Republicans in 20th century South Carolina shows how slowly that realignment spread. Strom Thurmond and Albert Watson became, in the modern era, the state's first Republicans in the Senate and House in 1964 and 1965. James Edwards didn't become the state's first Republican governor until 1974. The state's House and Senate became majority Republican only in 1994 and 2000, respectively. It is not surprising that the big change did not come all at once. Political scientist James Glazer noted, "Old-time hardline Southern Democrats and the mass public had to die out and be replaced." Ultimately, party realignment over civil rights stands as one of the central arcs of 20th century political history. The Democratic Party's evolution from being a defender of slavery, segregation, and white supremacy to a champion of civil rights represented a massive revolution in the political scheme, one that prompted an equally significant reaction as the Republican Party retreated from its roots in racial liberalism to embrace and exploit the politics of white grievance. Realignment was a glacial change, in both senses of the term, moving slowly but thoroughly transforming the landscape that it left behind. Amply chronicled by journalists at the time and thoroughly detailed by historians and political scientists in the decades since, this long conventional narrative has been grounded in the private words and public deeds of Republican presidents and presidential candidates, administration figures and campaign strategists, and even national, regional, and state leaders of the Republican National Committee. These individuals' embrace of the Southern strategy was cemented in changes at the party level, such as official platforms and convention delegations, and readily recognized by outside observers ranging from political journalists to public opinion surveys and polling data. These realities of the Republican Party's past, of course, do not dictate its future. Just as one generation of political figures chose to inflame white resentment for their own gain, later generations could reject that path. At the start of the 21st century, Republicans seemed intent on turning the page. Under President George W. Bush, the GOP strengthened its outreach to African Americans and other racial minorities. The Bush administration featured a racially diverse cabinet, with African Americans and Latinos in prominent posts, and promoted policies such as immigration reform. Notably, in 2005, RNC Chairman Ken Mehlman directly apologized for the Southern strategy in an address to the NAACP. Some Republicans gave up on winning the African American vote, looking the other way or trying to benefit politically from racial polarization. I am here today as the Republican chairman to tell you we were wrong. Michael Steele, another RNC chairman and the first African American in that role, echoed Mehlman in 2010, acknowledging that for the last 40-plus years we had a Southern strategy that alienated many minority voters by focusing on the white male vote in the South. This frank reckoning with Republicans' past racism proved short-lived. Pundits on the right denounced it as weakness or worse. Radio star Rush Limbaugh compared Mehlman's decision to go down there and basically apologize for what has come to be known as the Southern strategy popularized by the Nixon administration to sexual assault. Once again, Republicans are going to go bend over and grab the ankles. When Democrats rallied around Barack Obama, the first African American candidate from a major party and the first to serve as president, Republicans retreated from the racial outreach of the Bush years and returned to the politics of resentment. During the reign of President Donald Trump, who pandered to white nationalists and promised to protect monuments to the Confederacy, the GOP reverted to its earlier form with a vengeance. Due to the success of the Southern strategy, Republicans are now unrecognizable as the party of Lincoln.